In this video, Jordan Peterson explains why you act the way you do.
Nietzsche said once that a philosopher was seldom anything other than the unconscious advocate of their cultural worldview. So what he meant by that was, you already come to the scene with a set of presuppositions. Now, some of those are embedded in your behavior. So, for example, when you attend a funeral, you know how to behave. Generally, you're quiet and solemn. You might not be able to explicate the rules that a person should follow at a funeral, but you can do it. Now, you could perhaps articulate them if pressed, but it's not like you're following those rules when you go to a funeral. You just know what to do. If someone pressed you, you could turn it into a list of rules. But it's really more encoded in your actual behavior. You just automatically know what to do. You can tell, whenever you interact with someone who's really socially fluent, you can tell that they're not consciously processing the way that they're acting. Otherwise, they're self-conscious and awkward. They're just very fluid. It's automatized behavior, and it's coded right into them. So if you're a great philosopher, then, according to Nietzsche at least, what you do is you take a look at how you act and what you think, and then you say, well, this is what it's like. It's not so much that you're inventing new ideas. It's that you're articulating the nature of structures that are already there. So you can imagine, for example, imagine that you're particularly interested in wolves. And so you go out and you study some wolves, and one of the things you see is that the wolves have a dominance hierarchy, so there's a leader, and then there is struggle in the pack to see who's going to be the dominant leader. Now, there's a couple of problems with that, which is that, if Wolf A and Wolf B fight, and they're pretty evenly matched, and they tear each other to shreds, then Wolf C is going to come in and pound both of them, and that's not a particularly useful strategy for Wolf A or for Wolf B. Plus, then the pack loses the power of Wolf A and Wolf B, and so that's hardly useful at all. So what's happened is that wolves have evolved dominance and submission strategies so that they can figure out who is going to lead and who is going to follow without having to engage in the kind of physical combat that's going to result in damage. And so usually what happens is that the two wolves face off. You've probably seen cats do this when they encounter each other, out on the street. The first thing they do is sort of turn sideways and they puff themselves up, right? And they dance back and forth. It's quite comical. But what the cat's trying to do is look big. And it's trying to make the other cat nervous enough to leave. And so what wolves do is roughly the same thing. They puff out so they look big, and they make all sorts of ferocious noises, and they threaten each other. And usually what happens is one wolf will lose his nerve, flop down, roll over, show his throat. And that basically means something like, I'm useless and pathetic, and you can tear out my throat if you want because of that. And the other wolf thinks, yeah, you are pretty useful and pathetic, but, we're going to need you tomorrow to hunt down a deer, so, you can get up and protect your miserable self, and that'll be okay. Now, if you were watching that, you might say, wolves follow rules. But, of course, they don't. That's just how wolves act. When you describe what the wolves are doing, then you turn it into a rule. But it wasn't a rule to begin with. It was just a pattern of behavior. Now, human beings are like that. We're chock full of patterns of behavior. And they're the consequence of our biology, which is something we'll talk about in depth in the last half of the course. And they're a consequence of our culture. And they're built into our bodies. Like every time you interact with another person, they're telling you how to behave, right? Don't be too obtuse. Try to be a little bit witty. Have something interesting to say. Don't be too annoying. If you're going to say something funny, make sure it's funny. Take turns while you talk. Play nicely. Take your turn. Don't eat all the bread, etc., etc. And so if you don't abide by those rules, then people lift their eyebrow at you, or they don't smile at your jokes, or they don't look at you, or they roll their eyes when you come in, which is really not a good sign, by the way. And you get punished severely for it. And then if you do act like they would like you to act, then people smile at you, and they invite you to their place for dinner, and maybe you have an intimate relationship and some people that like you. And so we're exchanging information about how we should manifest ourselves in our bodies with every possible interaction. And what that means is that shapes the way that we act. Now, the problem is, or partly, is that you don't really understand the consequences of that. Like, you can act it out, more or less, depending on your social skill and the degree to which you've been exposed to other people. But that doesn't mean you're a conscious that you can consciously articulate all the rules that underlie that. And if you think that maybe you can, well, fine. Imagine a well-behaved 4-year-old. By 4, you've got a lot of the social rules down, because by 4 you can play with others. If you're ever going to be able to, you can already do it by the time you're 4. If you can't by the time you're 4, you are in serious trouble, because other kids won't play with you, and then they won't teach you how to act, and then you stay immature and isolated and, off in your little corner, dejected and bitter for the rest of your life. Now, you might think that's a little rough, but it's not. That's what the data indicate. So anyways, what this means in part is, well, we've been shaping how all of us behave as long as we've been social. Now, you might say, well, how long have we been social? Well, crustaceans are social. So lobsters, for example, organize themselves into dominance hierarchies, and they modify each other's behavior. And that's 400 million years. So we've been social and living in groups since our ancestors departed on the evolutionary timescale from the ancestors of lobsters. So that's a very, very, very long time. There weren't any trees around back then. So social life is older than trees. So you can be sure that you're adapted to it in a major way. So it's built into your biology, but then there's the historical element of it too. And we're quite flexible from a cultural perspective. So there's an example, this guy named Robert Sapolsky, who I really like. He's a great scientist. He went off to Africa to study baboons. And baboons are not pleasant, generally speaking. They fight a lot, they're bullies, they bite. They can really bite a baboon. Like a predatory cat will think twice about taking on a baboon. They've got major teeth, and their temperament is not particularly positive. Sapolsky went and studied a group of baboons, and they were engaged in typical baboon gang behavior, harassing each other all the time and bullying each other. And they were all stressed out, because Sapolsky knew that, because he measured their levels of stress and their testosterone and so forth. And so it was a pretty miserable baboon existence. But then what happened was that the baboons went to feed somewhere that I don't remember, and a lot of them contracted tuberculosis. And it turned out that almost all the hyper-aggressive males got tuberculosis and died. And all that was left was the beta males, roughly speaking. And then the whole baboon culture transformed so that it became much more agreeable and much more cooperative. And then when aggressive baboons would move into that territory, singly, on their own, then they'd get all placid and calm too. So it's interesting, because obviously baboons aren't social to the degree that we are, but it does indicate that even at the advanced primate level, their brains are pretty big, but not as big as ours, that cultural transmission of behavior expectation can be quite powerful, and it can transform quite rapidly. So, anyways,